William Jennings Bryan, the Great Commoner. Right now we're going to talk about William Jennings Bryan, the life before the Scopes trial. His family, his new family, politics, some speeches, and more. Family. First off, his father's name was Silas Lillard Bryan. He was a Jacksonian Democrat who was very passionate about politics, and this could be where Bryan's political mind stems from. His dad was elected to the state senate of Illinois in the 1850s, and although he was not reelected in 1860, he still had a very strong political mind. In 1866, his dad bought and moved the family to a 520-acre farm just north of Bryan's birthplace, which was Salem, Illinois. His mother was Maria Elizabeth Jennings, now Bryan, and she was a Methodist throughout his childhood, which made going to church fairly hard because Silas was a Baptist. So Bryan would be going to Baptist services in the morning and then to Methodist ones in the afternoon. However, once his father accepted a deacon position at one of the churches near Salem, she transferred her membership to the Baptist community. Thus, he freed up his afternoons. And his mother was also his teacher up until he was 10. So a little bit of info on William Jennings Bryan. He was born March 19th, 1860, and he died on July 26, 1925. He was raised in and near Salem, Illinois, on the 520-acre farm, and a little interesting fact that it was a very envied property in the county, although his father was very generous and would always have space in his acreage to house other people. Moving on to Bryan's education. The early years, as I mentioned before, he was homeschooled until the age of 10, and his mother was the main teacher for that. And this may be why he didn't quite excel in high school, although he had very, very good oratory skills. He was very involved in his debate club, and public speaking was something that he really excelled in throughout high school, and as we shall see, that really benefited him later on throughout his career. And yes, he did attend Whipple Academy, which was a move for him from Salem to Jacksonville, Illinois. His university career was pretty illustrious. He actually excelled in the academic sphere, and he became the valedictorian of his 1881 class at Illinois College. Upon graduation, he immediately attended Union Law College in Chicago, which is now Northwestern University School of Law, and he graduated in 1883. And as mentioned before, he continuously excelled in public speaking, and this was all throughout. Even in university, he was part of a literary club, and that really helped him in that aspect. Sticking with the traditional fashion of his time, we are going to talk about his courting and new family phase. While studying for the bar and teaching at the same time, he met his wife, Mary Elizabeth Baird, and they got married in 1884. A very short courting phase, and they both ended up becoming lawyers as they were both studying for the bar when they met, and she helped him throughout his career with speeches and all of his writing. They had 3 kids, and their names are Ruth Bryan, eventually Owen, William Jennings Bryan Jr., and Grace Bryan. And during that time, they settled in Jacksonville where they met and where they had gone to school, and they stayed there until 1887, in which time they moved to Lincoln, Nebraska, which was considered to be the up-and-coming epicenter of the time. This will be our first politics section. Bryan was very involved in this aspect of the United States during his time, and thus it needs to be covered in 2 sections, and there's also a section of his life in the middle which separates his 2 stints in politics. So this is the first one from 1890 to 1908. And in 1890, he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. He was only the second Democrat in history to actually win a seat into the U.S. House of Representatives. And this was done through the help of one of his good friends who was the chairman of the Democrats in Nebraska. And he was part and parcel part of the good fortune of the Democrats in 1890 when he was elected to the House of Representatives, because it was a Democratic landslide in that election. In 1892, he was also re-elected to that same spot in the House of Representatives. However, this was by a very narrow margin, and thus his popularity kind of seemed to be dwindling for his position that he was in. In 1894, he ran for the Senate, but was defeated by a very big margin. This was kind of the opposite end of the spectrum for him from 1890 to 1894, where he was part of the bad luck of the Democrats, where there was a Republican landslide in the votings, and thus he was defeated very handily. Moving on to the White House, which I have named a three-part series. Part 1. What would make a person say, hey, I just got crushed in a Senate election, so I should run for president in 2 years? That's beyond my understanding. However, this is exactly what Bryan did. However, that was not to his benefit, because in 1896, when he first ran for the presidential position, he was defeated by Arthur Sewall. Part 2 of this three-part series is not that well either. However, I'm pretty sure everyone here has heard the Herman's Hermit song, I'm Henry VIII I Am, and heard the favorite line, second verse, same as the first. Well, that is Bryan's story here in 1900, as he ran for the White House for a second time, and for a second time he was defeated by his opponent. William McKinley was the opponent in this election. Part 3, and by now I'm assuming you can see the pattern. He's a three-time loser, and in the third campaign he had taken one off. He came back to it in 1908 and was yet again defeated by William Howard Taft. The oration part of this presentation is going to highlight from the 1900s to 1912. And during that time, Bryan thankfully did not throw all his eggs into his political basket, and thus he was part of the Chautauqua circuit, which was a circuit of orators who would perform speeches and give public addresses for people, and he was one of the most sought-after orators part of that circuit. It's recorded that he's taken up to $500 per speech at points, and that is just the flat rate, plus he would get a percentage of the profits gathered from the speeches or public addresses he was giving. Most of his speeches were of the Christian influence. However, he did take a few that were not particularly Christian, and he was completely fine with that. And one of those was the value of an ideal, which called people to public service, and was very powerful and one of his most notable speeches. Another notable speech of his is the Prince of Peace. This is also claimed to be one of his favorite speeches that he actually wrote and delivered. An interesting fact with all his work that he did in this oration period of his career was that he was able to save enough money, and like his father, invested it in land, and he bought 240 acres in Nebraska, and he also earned enough money through public speaking to buy a ranch in Texas. And now to the much-awaited sequel of Bryan's political career, and that would be when he was elected to be Secretary of State. And that was from 1913 to 1915, in which time he negotiated 28 treaties, and he also tried to negotiate a treaty with Germany in World War I, but failed to do so, obviously. However, during this period, he differed in opinion on what war policies should be enforced and how they should be enforced and how they should be developed, and thus he found it too difficult and necessary for him, with a conflicting viewpoint from the president. He needed to step down from his position early in 1915. Upon stepping down from his position of Secretary of State, he ramped up what he was doing. He went into ministry and had a huge role in activism in the southern states. He moved to Miami, Florida in 1913, and specifically to Coconut Grove. This could be seen to be a pushback against all of the quote-unquote wet German Americans in Nebraska. However, I feel that there's probably a little bit of a sense of, the fact that the weather is a lot nicer in Miami and he's getting older, that this would be something that he would just naturally tend to do. As we know, Florida is the retirement place for all peoples. Also, he was a huge activist in the Prohibition, thus the wet move. He was a huge supporter. National campaign to pass the 18th Amendment, which was passed in order to close all of the saloons in 1920, and this amendment was passed in 1918. And he also followed up that with a big push for the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act. He was the chief proponent for that act, and with his popularity from all of the presidential campaigns and his ability in public speaking, his name was well known. Allowing him being the chief proponent for this act, it just made it super obvious that this was going to work out, and it did. And this has led to the modern war on drugs policies that we have today and that the U.S. has today. Big proponent in that, and this was also not a fully moral thing, but more of an international necessity for them to represent the USA as a country that is not going to be overtaken by narcotics or alcohol. He's also a big proponent in the anti-evolution campaigns. He launched his campaign formally, on October 1st in 1921 at Union Theological Seminary in Richmond, Virginia. He based a lot of what he said on an article written in 1916, and this was kind of his sparking point, where he read shocking statistics of how university students would lose their faith throughout the 4 years of university, and this he saw as the power behind Darwinism, as they are creating leaders that would be probably, in his eyes, less moral. So he pushed back against that, and his 1921 speech at Union Theological Seminary was recorded, and the Sprunt lectures is what they were called, and they were published as In His Image, and they sold over 100,000 copies. And this was a lecture series, and his specific lecture called The Origin of Man was also published, and it also sold very, very well. Now we will move on to the main address, the Scopes trial. And although this is seen as a very historical moment, I'm posing the question whether this is historically significant or not. The Scopes trials, which are named after John T. Scopes, who was charged for teaching evolution in public schools, which was a violation of the Butler Act, which made teaching evolution illegal in Tennessee. Bryan was the prosecutor in this court case, and he was brought in by William Bell Riley to represent the World Christian Fundamentals Association at the trial, and his counterpart was Clarence Darrow, who was part of the American Civil Liberties Union. And this court case was kind of a big setup for the fundamentalists of the day, which Bryan represented, by the American Civil Liberties Union and Clarence Darrow, because there's records showing that Scopes had taken on this position and accepted the trial, and it was set up. It wasn't something that was properly done, and even Scopes had coached his students of the time to testify against him and how they would answer questions and what they would say. And partway through the trial, Darrow had gone on record saying that he was basically trying to make Bryan look like a fool by the end of the trial. Thus, it became a showdown between Darrow and Bryan rather than seeking the justice for John Scopes. And this court case is seen as the Achilles heel for fundamentalists in the USA, because after this point, fundamentalism tended to subside and modernists took the stage. Bryan took the stand in this trial for cross-examination from his counterpart, Darrow, and he proceeded to ask him, about the flood, and Bryan mentioned that it was 4,000 years ago, and then Darrow brings up the Chinese civilization that had been traced back for 7,000 years, Bryan conceding that he was ignorant of this point, thus trying to ruin some of the credibility for Bryan in this, showing that he's ignorant of the other person's perspective, and only solely pursuing his perspective without considering the other one. I guess he succeeded. However, the judge retroactively expunged all of Bryan's answers from the cross-examination, thus it was never held in record in the court. However, Bryan did succeed in getting a guilty verdict. However small the win was, it was just a simple fine of $100, which later was overturned on a technicality. The Scopes trials are claimed to be the final blow to fundamentalism. However, as I posed before, is this historically relevant? Is this the last straw for fundamentalism? Is this relevant to Christian history? I believe it contributes to the shift in many things in Christian history. It mainly affects the anti-evolution campaign, and it creates a reason to doubt the fundamentalist Christians. But yes, this trial is seen as the icon. However, the true cause and effect here is Bryan's death 6 days after the conclusion of the Scopes trial. His death tore apart the anti-evolution campaign that was happening, because he was the glue that held everything together. He was the only figurehead that could perform a national-wide campaign to promote anti-evolution. And with his death 6 days after the conclusion of the Scopes trial, it just tore apart that. And he was a big part of the fundamentalists of the South. He was in the core of the group, and this just made everything kind of fall apart in differing opinions. He was no longer there as the glue to hold everything together. Thus, that is more of the historical significant part of the Scopes trial, is the fact that so close after, his death happened and caused a huge ripple effect throughout the rest of the fundamental community. So that is just a little snippet of William Jennings Bryan's life. As I've coined here, the great commoner whose death shocked the fundamentalist world into decline. Some fun nicknames to conclude, as I've previously mentioned in the title and ending slide. The top nickname that he was given throughout his life was the Great Commoner. The second one was the Silver Knight of the West. The third, Boy Orator of the Platte. And a satirical one given to him by a journalistic counterpart was the Fundamentalist Pope.